The Ardennes section of the front, where von Rundstedt's offensive began, was held in the north by 2 divisions that had not yet been exposed to fire, and in the south by 2 more experienced divisions that had been fighting in the Gürchen forest for a month and were badly battered. The Middleton section was the only quiet place on our front, and we sent there newly arrived formations that lacked combat experience, as well as formations that came out of the battle and needed rest and replenishment. 4 divisions occupied a 140-kilometre stretch of the front in a deep forest area. An unfired armoured division was concentrated in reserve. South of the Ardennes, 3rd Army wedged into the Siegfried Line, creating a bridgehead on the east bank of the Saar River. To the right of the 3rd Army, the 7th Army occupied a front that stretched from the Saar River in an easterly direction, jutting into the Rhine near Karlsruhe. The 6th Army Group Divers came to the west bank of the Rhine opposite the Black Forest Mountains, and only in the area of Colmar the enemy continued to hold a significant bridgehead west of the Rhine. On 13th December, 3 days before the start of the German counteroffensive, Hodges again tried to seize the dams on the Ruhr River. The British Air Force failed to destroy these gigantic earthworks with large-caliber high-explosive bombs. However, this time Hodges abandoned his intention to advance through the Gürchen forest and decided to bypass the dams from the south along the mountain's Schneeeifel. Further to the north near Aachen, Hodges's front issued forward, adjacent to the front of Simpson's 9th Army along the Ruhr River. The front line then withdrew westwards into the Montgomery sector, followed the west bank of the Maas River, and finally turned steeply westwards to the North Sea. On the Western Front, the length of 640 kilometres acted 63 Allied divisions, including 40 American, of which 31 divisions were part of the 12th Army Group. In the 2 armies of Montgomery had 15 divisions, in the 6th Army Group Divers 17. On the front of the 12th Army Group, a total length of 370 kilometres, operated 3 American armies. The lion's share of this front fell on the 1st Army Hodges, occupying the central section of 185 kilometres. The front of the 1st Army for 2/3 passed through the forested Ardennes. In the Ardennes, Hodges positioned 4 divisions of the 8th Corps Middleton. The remaining 10 divisions of the Army Hodges, intended for the offensive in the Rhineland, were concentrated in the area of Aachen. North of the area occupied by the 1st Army, on a narrow 30-kilometre front, were 7 divisions of Simpson's 9th Army. Thus the combined Allied forces north of the Ardennes, in addition to Monty's British divisions, included 17 American divisions. This grouping accounted for about half of the total Allied forces on the Western Front. South of the Ardennes, Patton deployed 10 divisions of his 3rd Army on a 160-kilometre front. Patton's front followed the eastern bank of the Moselle River, where it flows along the Luxembourg border, then turned southeast and passed Saarbrücken, which was halfway to the Rhine. Von Rundstedt's offensive had taken me by surprise, but my surprise was further increased when I learned that the German Field Marshal had chosen such an unimportant area as the Ardennes for the offensive. Trying to determine the extent of the threat to us in the weakly defended section of the Ardennes, I discussed with Middleton motives that the enemy may have been guided in choosing this particular direction to strike. If anyone goes on the offensive, I said, he does so with the aim of either destroying the enemy's troops or capturing the terrain. In the latter case, he either wants to use the favourable terrain himself or to prevent the enemy from using it. Neither of these aims could be achieved in the Ardennes. Nowhere were our troops so stretched as on this wooded section of the front. Nowhere on the Allied front was there any other section deprived to such an extent as the Ardennes of industrial resources, communications and natural frontiers worthy of consideration. I asked Troy if he could prevent an enemy breakthrough in this section, which did not bode well for the Germans. In reply, he pointed to the mountainous forested terrain and led me along the narrow, muddy and winding roads that crossed his section. If they break through here, he said, we can fall back and fight a holding battle all the way to the Maas. We'll wear them down, of course, and then you hit them in the flanks. I reported the results of my reconnaissance to Ike. Ike noticed that in the Ardennes is quite a dangerous situation, but he admitted that we could create a solid defense in this area, only by refusing to prepare for a new winter offensive. But even if the Germans manage to break through to the Maas, I said, still in the Ardennes there is no goal to which they should strive. We have not forgotten that the defeat of France in 1940, Hitler began with a breakthrough in these same seemingly unpromising Ardennes. Some critics believe that this precedent should have served as a formidable warning to us. In doing so, they overlook the fundamental difference in the disposition of the Allied forces in 1940 and in 1944, a difference that Hitler himself probably overlooked. The artificial division of the territories of nation-states in Europe left France without a natural barrier to protect it from invasion from the east. Many routes lead into France from the east, but undoubtedly the least convenient of these passes through the Ardennes. In this mountainous region, covered with dense forests, with few valleys and even fewer roads, the maneuver of troops is extremely limited. In 1940, however, of the 4 invasion routes by which Hitler could move his troops, the route through the Ardennes was covered the weakest. French artillery from the heights of the Black Forest dominated the Rhine crossings. Further north, where the hills of Lorraine gradually pass into the Saar lowlands, the fortress artillery of the Maginot Line could give the Wehrmacht a lot of trouble. And even north of the Ardennes, where the plains of Belgium are a wide road to the French borders, on the west bank of the Meuse the Germans were waiting for the Belgian army and the British Expeditionary Force. Only the Ardennes remained, in the northern part of which the unprotected border of Luxembourg ran parallel to the Siegfried Line. When the Germans interrupted the Allied front in the Ardennes in 1940, French fortress garrisons were left on both sides of the breakthrough, without vehicles or tanks, and therefore without the ability to flank the enemy and close the gap created in the front. In the winter of 1944, we had relatively few troops on the Ardennes section of the front. We concentrated our main forces north and south of the Ardennes, preparing for the upcoming winter offensive. But still in the Ardennes the front was held by more than 70,000 troops. In these conditions, the mobility of our perfectly armed formations, concentrated on the flanks of the Ardennes section, became decisive. Planning his second offensive in the Ardennes, Hitler underestimated this decisive factor. He forgot that times have changed and he is no longer confronted by garrisons chained to their concrete casemates on the Maginot Line, but by a huge mechanized army, fully planted on machines. We understood the real danger of an enemy breakthrough in the Ardennes, but we expected to be able to bring our mechanized forces down swiftly on his flanks. While Middleton's troops would wear down the enemy with rearguard fighting, Hodges' and Patton's armies on both sides would pin the Germans in a steel vise. South of the Ardennes, Patton's Third Army numbered about 250,000 men with tanks and supporting artillery. Hodges' First Army north of the Ardennes also numbered 250,000. Both armies had a sufficient number of trucks and could quickly move their troops to the threatened direction. The news of the German counter-offensive caught me at the supreme headquarters of the Allied Expeditionary Force. At first I thought that von Rundstedt had undertaken the offensive for the limited purpose of halting Patton's advance in the Saar. For George Patton, in a month-long winter offensive, had dealt the enemy a crushing blow and was now about to break through the Siegfried Line, having regained Lorraine to France. The German knows that he can only hold out longer if he forces Patton to relax somewhat the pressure in the Saar, I said. If he breaks through the Ardennes and forces us to move Patton's divisions from the Saar to this section, he will have achieved his objective. He wants to buy at least a little time. It was only after the war, when interrogation of prisoners of war revealed the true objectives of the Ardennes counteroffensive, is that we learnt how badly I had been mistaken and to what extent I had underestimated the enemy's intentions by mistaking a counteroffensive on a large scale for a diversionary strike. I had believed that Rundstedt had launched the diversionary offensive for tactical purposes in the hope of halting Patton's advance in the Saar region. However, the German counteroffensive was a decisive blow calculated to regain the initiative on the Western Front. The enemy's first objective was Antwerp. The German command realized that by seizing this port, it would be able to cut off our main communications and isolate the 4 Allied armies north of the Ardennes. Although the enemy could no longer entertain unfulfilled hopes of victory on the Western Front, he still hoped to improve their situation by inflicting heavy losses on the Allies and bringing disorganization to their ranks. A successful counter-offensive in the Ardennes could delay our offensive on the Western Front, and the Germans would have the opportunity to strike the Red Army, which was concentrating its troops on the Vistula. In addition, the German command hoped that the counter-offensive would have a psychological impact on the German population, which was beginning to realize the futility of further fighting. Allied armies were approaching German cities, already destroyed by airstrikes, and the German people began to feel the approach of disaster. However, the moral factor played a secondary role in planning the Ardennes counteroffensive. Hitler decided to put his last resources at stake, hoping to achieve strategic success. The Germans' development of the counteroffensive began in October, almost simultaneously with the exhaustion of our rapid offensive in France. Planning was in full swing 3 weeks before Montgomery cleared the Scheldt of the enemy. Before choosing the direction of the blow, the enemy had determined the necessary conditions that would allow him to go on the counteroffensive. First of all, he had to hold in his hands at any cost defensive positions on the Western Front. As long as the rivers Maas and Ruhr and the Siegfried Line served as a serious obstacle to the Allied offensive, the Germans could weaken their garrisons in the west in order to allocate reserves for the counteroffensive. In addition, the stability of the Eastern Front was equally important to them. Had the Red Army launched an offensive at this critical moment, the reserves intended for the Western Front would have had to be thrown to the east. Finally, in order to gather sufficient forces, the enemy first had to allocate to the troops supplies for the forthcoming offensive operation. We usually conducted our engagements in good weather, which allowed aircraft to support ground troops. The enemy's calculations were based on other considerations. Due to the almost total absence of aviation, he had to postpone the start of the offensive until low cloud cover was guaranteed for at least 10 days. Only low solid cloud cover could conceal the movements of German troops from Allied air reconnaissance and save German columns from air strikes. Finally, the German command was well aware that only when using the factor of surprise it can hope for a quick defeat of the opposing Allied forces. The Germans could not count on sufficient reserves to develop a strike in depth. The success of the enemy almost entirely depended on whether he was able to break through our front with lightning speed, before we have time to remove troops from areas north or south of the Ardennes and throw them on the flanks of the breakthrough. And so the German command began to look for a section of the front, which would not be deeply echeloned positions and where it could count on a lightning breakthrough. Such an area was found in the Ardennes, where German intelligence in detail knew the combat composition and disposition of our troops. Moreover, as long as the enemy held the dams on the Ruhr River, his northern flank was reliably covered from Allied counterattacks. The Germans knew that we would not dare to force the Ruhr as long as they owned the locks of the dams in the Eifel Mountains. And south of the Ardennes, the enemy could rely on the fortifications of the Siegfried Line. On 12 October, the day Hodges stormed the ruined northern outskirts of Aachen, the German High Command gave the directive to begin preparations for a counter-offensive in the Ardennes. 4 German armies were assigned to this audaciously conceived operation. 2 of them, the 5th Panzer Army and the 6th SS Panzer Army, were to break through the Ardennes front and cut into Middleton's fighting order. Hitler assigned the main task to General Sepp Dietrich, commander of the 6th SS Panzer Army. The flanks of this grouping covered the 15th and 7th Armies, operating north and south of the direction of the main strike. The leadership of the counter-offensive was entrusted to Field Marshal Model, commander of Army Group B. The overall operational leadership and responsibility for the success of the counter-offensive was entrusted to the Commander-in-Chief of Army Group West, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt. The Germans intended to launch a counter-offensive on 26 to 28 November, provided that by that time the weather would be bad and von Rundstedt would have time to finish the preparation of the operation. Von Rundstedt's plan was skillfully drawn up. In it felt the ingenuity and experience of the old commander. In fact, if the forces of the Germans even to some extent corresponded to the task assigned to them by Hitler, von Rundstedt could cause us much more trouble than he actually caused. In the vanguard of the advancing forces acted 6th SS Panzer Army. Its task was to break through the Ardennes, force the Maas between Jai and Liege, then make a rush northwest to Antwerp, where the enemy hoped to seize our supplies, and thus at our expense to ensure the supply of their troops. Meanwhile, another group of troops was to separate from the main forces of the 6th Army north of the Maas, bypass Liege and strike at Maastricht, the main road junction of the 9th American Army. To the left of the enemy's 6th SS Panzer Army, which operated in the direction of the main strike, parallel to it was advancing German 5th Panzer Army, which crossed the Meuse between Dinan and Namur and then moved north to Brussels, covering the left flank and rear of the army of Sepp Dietrich. To the south, the newly formed 7th Army was to break through the Eifel Massif, forcing the River Sur with the task of covering the southern flank of the strike group on the territory of Luxembourg, extending from the Mosel Valley on the German border to the mountainous town of Dinan on the Meuse. The German command believed that Hodges would be able to concentrate large forces north of the advancing German armies and hit them in the flank. Therefore, von Rundstedt placed here the 15th Army, which was to keep the breakthrough area in the Ardennes open. In the task of infantry compounds, Sepp Dietrich was only to clear the way for tanks. After that, they, together with the troops of the 15th Army, took positions to cover the breakthrough site from the north. The German command saw salvation only in the rapidity of the offensive, so in the breakthrough entered only tanks. Initially, the enemy intended to include in the grouping allocated for the counter-offensive from 25 to 30 divisions. However, by 16th December he managed by some miracle to concentrate a much larger number of troops in all 4 armies. There were 36 divisions. Among them were the 4 first-class SS Panzer divisions that were part of Sepp Dietrich's 6th Army. Hasso von Manteuffel's 5th Tank Army, operating to the left of the 6th Tank Army, consisted of 3 conventional tank divisions and 4 infantry divisions. In total, von Rundstedt concentrated 600 tanks for the offensive. I did not think that the Germans can concentrate forces with such amazing speed, and underestimated the offensive capabilities of the enemy. But it was not only me and the army commanders, but also Montgomery and Eisenhower. In early December, our intelligence believed that behind the Ruhr River concentrated 10 tank divisions of the enemy. 11th Panzer Division and 6 infantry divisions were located to the south in the Ardennes section. Although in the Ardennes was concentrated much more forces than was necessary Rundstedt for the defence of this area, we waited for a counterattack in the direction of the Ruhr River, not assuming that the enemy is nurturing much more daring plans. We knew that he could win the battle in this area, but we could not assume that he had sufficient forces to launch a strategic offensive. The enemy's intentions to try his luck in the Ardennes could only be justified if he aimed to reach such strategic sites as Antwerp and Liege. At the same time, if we consider that the limit of the enemy's ambitious plans could only be an offensive of local importance in order to disrupt preparations for an offensive on our part, then, in our opinion, we could successfully repel all attacks without serious damage to our front. Although we made a mistake in determining the enemy's intentions, nevertheless the assessment of his capabilities was made quite correctly. The following weeks showed that von Rundstedt lacked the strength and means to conduct a strategic offensive against such a powerful grouping as ours. Moreover, he had so used up his reserves in the Ardennes that 2 months later, when he was assigned the defence of the front on the Rhine River, he was no longer able to hold this important river frontier. In an effort to postpone for a few months the disaster that threatened him on the Western Front, Hitler unwittingly accelerated the denouement. In the early autumn, von Rundstedt came to the same conclusion as we did. He also believed that the Germans did not have enough forces to carry out the strategic offensive that Hitler had planned. When Hitler revealed his grand plan, von Rundstedt made a counter-proposal to launch an offensive on Aachen and restore the Siegfried Line. However, this stratagem was not successful. Hitler rudely rejected von Rundstedt's proposal, saying that it suffered from a lack of strategic purpose. However, although the enemy's resources fell far short of Hitler's claims, they were still admittedly somewhat greater than we thought when assessing the capabilities of the Germans. A typical example of this at the time was Montgomery's assessment of the Germans' offensive capabilities, given on 16th December in an order to 21st Army Group. If I had been asked to give my assessment that day, I would not have changed a single word from Monty, because his assessment was in complete agreement with mine. At present, the enemy has gone on the defensive on all fronts. His position does not permit him to launch a major offensive operation. Moreover, he must avoid maneuver warfare at all costs. The enemy has neither vehicles nor fuel, which is necessary for maneuver warfare. In addition, his tanks cannot compete with ours in maneuver combat. The enemy suffers defeat after defeat. He is badly battered and has suffered heavy losses in men and equipment. We can by no means weaken our onslaught or allow ourselves a respite for the winter months. We must continue the offensive in order to give the enemy no opportunity to recover and to inflict even greater losses. Our operations will be hampered by the thaw, cold weather, lack of air support during periods of bad weather, etc. But we must continue to fight hard against the enemy during the winter months. As soon as the Germans withdrew behind the Siegfried Line, the Allies began to lack information from secret agents. In France, the Germans were fighting in enemy territory. The French patriots informed us of the enemy's movements and harboured our agents thrown into his rear. In Germany, on the other hand, where the enemy was at home among his own people, our only informants here could only be traitors, and they were very rare. As a result, the wide stream of intelligence information coming to us from the German rear became a thin trickle. We depended more and more on the interrogation of prisoners of war, troop and air reconnaissance data. The success of the counter-offensive depended mainly on surprise, so concentrating his troops for a counter-offensive in the Ardennes, the enemy took the strictest measures to preserve military secrecy. All commanders privy to the plans for the operation signed a pledge of secrecy. Any hint of preparations for an offensive in radio conversations was forbidden. Written communication was maintained only through trusted couriers, and persons with knowledge of the plans for the operation were forbidden to fly west of the Rhine. Troops were to arrive at concentration areas at the very last moment only at night. An order was given to send all non-German soldiers to the rear from the forward positions for the period of preparation of the operation. In order to maintain the secrecy of the preparations, the command posts of the armies were to remain in their old places, maintaining the usual radio exchange. On top of this, in order to divert our attention from the Ardennes, a false headquarters was deployed to the north in front of the front of Simpson's army. When it was time to start moving reserves to the initial positions for the offensive on the Western Front, the weather established which von Rundstedt had hoped for. The sun was rarely shown, and the camera lenses of reconnaissance planes could not fix anything on film, except for a solid cloud cover. We threw agents into the rear of the enemy, but they disappeared in the winter twilight, and there was no further news about them. However, despite all these obstacles, the reconnaissance managed to detect some faint signs of the enemy's concentration of forces in the Ardennes. Unfortunately, these signs were not convincing enough. "What do they mean?" asked the scouts. "And what should we do about them?" It seemed to us that in the reports of German troop movements in the Eifel Mountains there was nothing alarming, nothing special. The enemy, like us, used this sector for resting divisions that had been battered in battle and for hardening newly arrived divisions. Therefore, many more movements could have taken place here than would be expected under normal conditions on such a quiet section of the front. Lacking more convincing evidence of the enemy's intentions, we could explain his increased activity during the night in the area of the Eifel Massif as follows: either he was concentrating forces for a counter-offensive in the direction of the Ruhr River, or he was endangering us in the Ardennes. The first assumption seemed more likely, since we were at greater risk on the Ruhr River than in the Ardennes. By taking the risk of a surprise enemy offensive in the Ardennes, we could continue preparations for the winter offensive, seize the dams on the Ruhr River, and thus force the enemy to put into battle his reserves west of the Rhine. But if we wanted to completely secure ourselves in the Ardennes, we had to abandon the preparation of the winter offensive, strengthen the front of the 8th Corps Middleton, reinforcing it with reinforcements necessary to repel the enemy counterattack. It was obvious that we did not have enough troops to simultaneously prepare for the winter offensive and strengthen our defences on other parts of the front. We were faced with the alternative of either going on the offensive immediately or postponing it until spring. At this point, only absolutely indisputable data on the preparation of the enemy offensive in the Ardennes could force me to abandon the winter offensive. And such data did not come to me until 5 a.m. On 16th December, when the enemy began artillery preparation. A rather paradoxical phenomenon occurred: our inability to recognize the preparations for an offensive in the Ardennes, in fact, saved us from heavy losses. If we had even doubled the number of divisions on the small forces occupied front of the 8th Corps Middleton, we still would not have been able to repel a powerful blow of tank forces von Rundstedt. The enemy had concentrated 24 divisions for the offensive in the Ardennes. With these forces he could have made a gap anywhere in our front. True, he would not have advanced so far if he had to break through strongly fortified positions, but he would undoubtedly have inflicted much heavier losses on Middleton's troops. For the same reasons, I am grateful to Eisenhower for rejecting Montgomery's suggestion that we stick to defensive tactics on Patton's Third Army front along the Moselle River. If we had stopped Patton and transferred part of his forces Hodges, then von Rundstedt could have chosen to break through it was his section, not the Ardennes. And if Rundstedt broke through with his tanks on the west bank of the Moselle, nothing would have prevented him from making a rush to Reims and seize the warehouses of communication zones, which had enough fuel and food to ensure the Germans' offensive all the way to Paris. Americans, imbued with a belief in the invincibility of American arms, find it extremely difficult to reconcile themselves to the idea that the U.S. Army is also sometimes not immune to defeat, even though it can fight valiantly to the limits of its strength. We are accustomed to blaming command and intelligence for all our failures. We forget that even the U.S. Army is not guaranteed against miscalculation and error. The initiative in battle can again go to the enemy, unless the latter is not completely defeated, and if we do not have an overwhelming superiority of forces. If we want to win the war by active combat, we must take risks. Even American intelligence cannot be recognized as infallible, much less can this be said of the American command. During the Battle of the Ardennes, the headquarters of the First Army was forced to hastily evacuate from Spa, and as if wishing to reward themselves for the humiliation suffered, the officers of this headquarters after the fighting began to dig through the reports and pick up quotes, proving that the First Army foresaw the danger of the German offensive, but its warnings were not taken into account in the higher headquarters, that is, the headquarters of the Army Group. Such assertions by the First Army are pure nonsense, for von Rundstedt succeeded in misleading the command of that army as skillfully as the rest of the Allied command. I accept full responsibility for the reasonable risk. We took in the Ardennes, but I reject the charge that I allegedly paid no attention to any warning signals. On 11th December, I visited Courtney Hodges at Spa. Some officers of the First Army headquarters are fond of saying that they gave timely warnings of impending danger, but the Army Group headquarters, because of their carelessness, were allegedly unwilling to heed their words. If these officers really warned, it must be said that they failed to convince their arguments not only the Army Group headquarters, but even their own army commander. Hodges was no less misled than we were by Rundstedt's demonstrative preparations for a counter-offensive in the Ruhr River area. During the next 4 days, First Army received some additional intelligence information about increased enemy activity in the Eifel Mountains. On 12th December, a prisoner of war reported that Hitler's Select Greater Germany Division had arrived in this quiet sector of the front. The next day, officers interrogating POWs came upon the trail of another Panzer division moved into the Eifel Massif area. This was the 116th Panzer Division, withdrawn from the section of the front in front of Simpson. On 14th December, a German informant told Middleton that pontoon crossing equipment was being concentrated near the Luxembourg borders on the east bank of the River Eure. Headquarters, First Army, commented on this report as follows. The report is of great interest. The concentration of troops is confirmed by tactical air reconnaissance and prisoner of war interviews. Given the presence of a large number of engineering units with crossing and bridge equipment, it can be assumed that the enemy is preparing not for defensive but for offensive action. But no matter how important these extracts from the reports may seem today, at that time they did not attract much attention at the Army Group headquarters. It must be said that at that time we were simply inundated with contradictory reports on enemy movements along the entire fountain. If the First Army in its assessment of the situation hit the mark, as some officers of its headquarters claim now, then at that time it did not suspect its own correctness. On 15th December, The head of the intelligence department of the First Army headquarters summarized the situation at the front as follows. Increased talk in the enemy troops about the offensive is explained by the desire of the German command to raise the morale of the troops. Nevertheless, the possibility of a local offensive operation timed to coincide with Christmas in order to gain a moral victory intended for the civilian population cannot be ruled out. Recently, many powers have been talking about an imminent offensive that will allegedly begin between 17 and 25th December. Some tell of the promise to recapture Aachen in order to present it as a Christmas present to the Führer. At this critical moment, solid cloud cover prevented Vandenberg's aerial reconnaissance from keeping watch, and von Rundstedt concentrated his troops for 3 days without fear of being detected from the air. It is true that the report of the Chief of Intelligence of the First Army contained a number of important intelligence data. However, he was not able to give them a proper assessment and did not reveal the preparation of the Germans' counter-offensive in the Ardennes, just as other prophets in the army headquarters, who later retrospectively boasted of their insight, were unable to do so. Although the reports of the First Army could be interpreted to mean that the Army Command was considering the possibility of an enemy offensive in the Ardennes, these warnings were nevertheless extremely vague. They lacked sufficient persuasiveness to compel us to postpone the timing of the winter offensive and begin preparations to repel the new threat. I knew Monk Dixon as one of the most capable and astute intelligence officers in the American Army. I had him as my chief of intelligence in Africa, Sicily, and in the invasion of the continent. But, like most intelligence officers, he was prone to pessimistic assessments and to undue anxiety. If I had taken precautions whenever Dixon or other scouts shouted "Wolf," "Wolf," we would never have ventured to initiate many of the risky actions that greatly hastened the approach of victory. The First Army's reports also failed to make the proper impression on Brigadier General Siebert, the Chief of Intelligence of my army group, who therefore did not see fit to warn me of the impending threat. At that time I had under my command almost 750,000 men on a front of 370 kilometers. I was simply physically unable to study the intelligence reports of all my subordinate formations. Therefore, for information about the capabilities and plans of the enemy, I relied entirely on my Chief of Intelligence and on the commanders of armies. Hodges never said a word to Middleton, one of his Corps commanders, about the warning signs in the Ardennes section, nor did he ever report them to me by telephone until the beginning of the offensive. Indeed, there was no man in the whole army group who would have come to me and warned me of the threat of a counterattack in that particular section. A week after Christmas, replying to General Marshall's holiday greeting, I wrote, "I cannot blame for what happened neither my commanders, nor my staff, nor myself. We deliberately took a risk, and the Germans hit us harder than we had anticipated. To this day, I have not changed my opinion. I prefer courage to caution in all cases, though caution is sometimes better." On 16th December, when the German offensive began, von Rundstedt took us by surprise in the reserve of the army group was not a single division. This situation for us was not unusual. We believed that the Germans are thoroughly defeated, and my conscience did not allow me, having in front of a weak enemy, to keep in reserve divisions that could be used for the offensive. Reserve of my group of armies never exceeded a few divisions, which I assigned to this or that army. The armies could use these divisions in their areas only with the authorization of the Army Group Command. The strategic reserve of the Allied High Command consisted of 2 airborne divisions. Both divisions had been battered in the battles of Arnhem and were on rest at Reims, where they were being re-staffed. These divisions were placed under the temporary command of Monty. The Allied High Command assumed that they would be involved in fighting for no more than 2 days before being replaced by British tank units. However, they had to fight in Holland for 58 days. As soon as I learned in the second half of 16th December about the German counter-offensive in the Ardennes, I connected by telephone from Eisenhower's bet with Patton, who was in Nancy. George's 10th Armoured Division was in reserve near Thionville, south of the Franco-Luxembourg border. I wanted to use this division to strike at the enemy's southern flank if he managed to break through Middleton's front. George, put the 10th Armoured on the road to Luxembourg, I ordered Patton, and have Morris nearly report to Middleton that he had taken over. As I expected, Patton began to object. The removal of the armoured division reduced his chances of a breakthrough into the Saarland. But there's no serious threat there, George persisted. Damn it, in all likelihood, this is just a demonstration designed to confuse us and make me stop the offensive. Maybe Patton was right, since not everything was still clear. But I decided not to take any chances. One of the motives that led us to deliberately take the risk in the Ardennes was the possibility of counterattacking the enemy in the flank, should he break through in that area. I hate like hell to take this division away from you myself, George, but I can't do otherwise. Even if it is only a demonstration, Middleton must be helped. A few minutes later, Patton gave the order over the phone. I then connected with my headquarters task force and informed Levin Allen of the order I had given Patton. At the same time, he told him to tell Simpson to reassign the 7th Armoured Division to Hodges so that if necessary, and it, like the 10th Armoured Division, could counterattack the broken-through troops von Rundstedt in the flank. Meanwhile, Major General Raymond Barton, commander of the 4th Division, already began to worry about the fate of his units, occupying the right flank of the defence on the border of Luxembourg. We had not had time to make up for the losses suffered by the 4th Division in the Gürtchen Forest, and the large shortage of personnel in the division at the beginning of the German offensive caused us serious concern for its fate. The next morning the enemy broke through the Sur River. Barton gathered all his cooks, bakers, clerks and threw them to the front lines. But we cannot stop the Germans, he warned Levin Allen, who was in Luxembourg, 30 kilometers from the front line. If the 10th Armoured does not come to our rescue, the Army Group Command should consider withdrawing troops from the front line. On Sunday 17th December, I woke up early in the morning in the beautiful stone villa that Ike occupied in Saint-Germain-en-Laye. The weather was still not favourable to air action, and I went immediately, as soon as I was free, to my headquarters. The day was drawing towards evening when we left Paris for Verdun. During the night, the Germans had dropped parachutists behind our lines with the task of cutting the roads on the northern flank of the breakthrough. This landing, like most night parachute landings, was dropped inaccurately, and the enemy parachutists scattered over a large area in our rear. Therefore, at Verdun, a guard armed with a machine gun was waiting for me in a jeep, which accompanied me the rest of the way. By the road to Luxembourg stood a small stone house, with a huge American flag hanging from its roof. I hope the owner of the house won't have to take it down, I said to Hansen, pointing to the flag. You think we'll hold out in Luxembourg? You can bet we will. I'm not going to change the command center. That would scare the hell out of everybody. Eisenhower later challenged my decision. Fearing that we might lose control of the troops if the enemy forced us to withdraw and disrupted communications, he recommended that we not play with fire and redeploy the headquarters task force back to Verdun, away from the front. I didn't follow his instructions, but not out of simple stubbornness. I explained to Ike that the slightest hint of a withdrawal of the Army Group headquarters could easily cause anxiety in the troops, and so panic in Luxembourg. Crowds of refugees would pour in and clog up all the roads just at the moment when troops should be moving along them. To guarantee this, we organized a parallel connection of all the compounds of the Army Group with Verdun, where the main part of the headquarters was located. If the HQ task force had to leave Luxembourg at gunpoint, we could switch control of our troops to Verdun without interrupting communications. Our car stopped in front of the brown brick railway administration building where the HQ task force was housed. In the operations room, I found Levin Allen immersed in thought over a map on which were plotted the enemy divisions identified during the fighting. 14 divisions had already been identified, 7 of them tank divisions. I looked at the map and was frightened. Forgive me, Lev, for my poor knowledge of French, but where did those sons of bitches get so many divisions? I asked. The next morning, 18th December, the enemy broke through the front in the central Ardennes, but on the flanks of our troops continued to hold firmly in the occupied positions. The main strike of Sept Dietrich was blocked by the troops of the First Army in the area of Malmedy. A few kilometers south of this mountain frontier, the 7th Armoured Division made a rapid rush to St. Vit, anticipating that the SS Panzer divisions would fight fiercely for this important road junction, opening the way to Liege. Barton's 4th Infantry Division on our right flank was at first even forced to retreat somewhat, but the timely arrival of the 10th Armoured Division strengthened its position, and our defence on the southern flank of the German breakthrough now seemed solid. In the centre, Manteufel's tanks had broken through the 28th Division's fighting order, crushed Middleton's reserves, and were moving on Bastogne, a town almost halfway between the Luxembourg capital and Liege. North of the hapless 28th Division's location, 2 regiments of the 106th Division were already surrounded in their positions. The remaining units of this newly arrived division were fighting fiercely at St. Vitus. Middleton, whose front was cracking at all seams, had anticipated my decision to hold Bastogne at all costs. When I called Troy to the telephone and ordered him to hold this important road junction, he replied that he had already given orders to entrench and defend the town. Parts of the 10th Armoured Division forced march to Bastogne from the south. They were intended to reinforce the tank units of the 9th Armoured Division defending this key point. In the evening, the 101st Airborne Division arrived at Bastogne, having made a rapid march from Reims by lorry, while north of Bastogne the 82nd Airborne Division continued to fight between Malmedy and St. Vitus, trying to loosen the vise in which the Germans had trapped it. If we could limit von Rundstedt's breakthrough to the section between Malmedy and Bastogne, 56 kilometers wide, firmly holding the flanks of the breakthrough, we could force the enemy to direct his troops strictly westward through the Ardennes, where they would be stuck in the forests, for in the section between Malmedy and Bastogne went west to the Meuse only 3 country roads winding. On the evening of 18th December, I was going to drive to Spa via Bastogne by car, but I received a call from Hodges's adjutant suggesting that I fly by plane. German saboteurs, speaking English and dressed in trophy American uniforms, had infiltrated our lines and were boldly trying to cause panic in our rear. A fortnight before, enemy orders for the formation of special reconnaissance units had fallen into our hands. These units were manned by volunteers selected and trained by the famous parachutist caper Lieutenant Colonel Otto Scorzeny. It was he who a year earlier had snatched Mussolini from an Italian hotel, where he was detained after his ouster from power. Most of these saboteurs, dressed in the uniforms of American soldiers, were apprehended before they reached the Mars. But this only happened when 500,000 American soldiers had had enough of playing cat and mouse with each other on all roads. Neither general's epaulettes, nor documents, nor protests escaped scrutiny at every crossroads. I myself had to prove my identity 3 times at the request of vigilant soldiers. The first time I aroused suspicion by identifying Springfield as the capital of Illinois, the second time by incorrectly stating the place of the fullback between centre forward and halfback on a football field, and the third time by failing to give the name of the next spouse of a blonde named Betty Grable. Because of Grable I was almost detained, but the sentry took pity on me. Satisfied that he had managed to stump me, he graciously allowed me to proceed. 2 days later it became clear that the enemy was planning something more than an offensive with a limited objective. In the battle order von Rundstedt wrote, "Addressing the troops, we put everything at stake and must not lose." In the headquarters of my army group decided that the purpose of the offensive can only serve as the capture of Liège, where there were many up-to-the-top filled field warehouses. I still could not assume that the ambitious plans of the enemy go beyond Liège, and that he expects to seize Antwerp. Hodges withdrew part of the troops from the front along the Ruhr River, moved them to the right flank of his army to repel a tank attack of the Germans, and entrenched on the defensive line between the Ardennes protrusion of the Germans and the Maas River. At this point I was ready to give orders to Patton to stop preparations for an offensive in the Saar. While the First Army was rolling north under the German attacks in the Ardennes, the Third Army, operating from its position on the Saar River, was to strike the enemy at the base of the Bulge. George was greatly distressed at the prospect of losing his bridgehead in the Siegfried Line. "What the hell," he shrugged his shoulders, "but nevertheless we shall still be killing Gans." That afternoon I left Luxembourg for Nancy with George in his jeep. "We don't want to involve your troops any more than will be absolutely necessary," I said. "I want to save them for a retaliatory strike, and we'll teach that bastard a lesson." George grinned and pulled his parka tighter. In order to relieve Patton's army and strike at the base of the Ardennes Bulge, Eisenhower had to stretch the front of the 6th Army Group Divers and replace the 3rd Army in positions along the Saar River. To agree on new delineation lines between the army groups, Eisenhower called a meeting at the 12th Army Group headquarters in Verdun on 19th December. He travelled to the meeting from Versailles in a heavy armoured car. The meeting was to be held in an unheated barracks. This precaution was insisted upon by counterintelligence. The Supreme Headquarters of the Allied Expeditionary Force received a report that Scorzeny instructed a special group of saboteurs to track down and kill the Supreme Commander of the Allied forces. Patton was to move for a counterattack on the Ardennes Bulge 2 of his 3 available corps in the Saar. Devers stretched his front to the left, occupying part of the Third Army's strip with his troops. Devers, like Patton, was not at all smiling at the prospect of giving up the offensive on the front of the 6th Army Group in order to help us clean up the mess that was brewing in the Ardennes. But he too was forced to submit to the strategic plan. Meanwhile, Patton, who in Sicily had swatted away logistical problems like pesky flies, showed that he had learnt his lesson well there. Taking advantage of the clear weather in September, he filled the field depots of his Third Army with crossing and bridging equipment. He intended to use this equipment to cross the Rhine. Fearing that Devers might not take advantage of the transfer of the dividing line between the army groups and misappropriate his supplies, George insisted that the area where his field stores were located should remain under his control. This prudence paid off 2 months later. When George had to force the Rhine, this was where his large stocks of crossing and bridging equipment came in handy, with the help of which he moved the Third Army to the east bank of the Rhine. In a small, cold room of the Verdun barracks, where only one bungled iron stove somewhat eased the penetrating December cold, we quickly agreed on a general plan for a counterattack on the flanks of the enemy in the Ardennes. Eisenhower had already approved the transfer of 2 corps of the Third Army to the new direction. The meeting was convened mainly to determine the extent to which Army Group Devers should participate in the upcoming operation. No one proposed another plan of action. The only option could be a withdrawal to the winter line along the Maas River. Even the theoreticians among the chiefs of operational departments, whose duties included studying all possible options, considered such a withdrawal unacceptable, and therefore did not plan it. I would have preferred to clamp the Germans in the Ardennes and advise a simultaneous counterattack on both flanks, but realized that Hodges is not able to go on the offensive until he stops the enemy's advance. And on 19th December, cramped by the Germans' First Army, more thought about how to contain the advancing enemy rather than a counterstrike. If Hodges could concentrate the strike group on his flank in the Malmedy area and throw it in the direction of St. Vith, he would narrow the breakthrough area and significantly reduce the German troops would be enclosed. However, the divisions he had withdrawn from the front running along the Ruhr River, he had to put into action piecemeal to prevent the enemy from breaking through to the Meuse. As the enemy went deeper and deeper into the Ardennes, seeking to find uncovered by our troops to break through to the Maas from the northern flank of the Bulge, Hodges increasingly stretched his battle orders, making desperate efforts to delay the Germans. If Sepp Dietrich's tanks had managed to overcome the First Army's resistance and rush on Liège, Hodges would in all likelihood have had to ease his pressure on the German flank in the Malmedy area. It was at Malmedy that Hodges saved the First Army by decimating the enemy's main force. However, if Hodges could not strike at the northern flank of the enemy, then nothing could prevent Patton to hit the Ardennes Bulge from the south. Indeed, the position of the First Army had become so serious that Patton's diversionary strike became absolutely necessary. We feared that otherwise Hodges' front would collapse and the enemy would force the Meuse. Meanwhile, in the area of Bastogne, which is a road junction, created a critical situation for our troops. The 5th Tank Army Manteuffel, operating in the center of von Rundstedt's group, bypassed this resistance junction, seeking to cut the roads leading from Bastogne to the south and north. Anticipating the encirclement of Bastogne, I nevertheless ordered Middleton's 8th Corps to hold this important communications junction. I did not entertain the idea of abandoning Bastogne and allowing the enemy to increase the area of the enclosure. Although the Airborne Division and 2 combat commands moved, there could suffer heavy losses in the defense of the town. Although I was not inclined to downplay the ordeal of the defenders of Bastogne, I was confident that the 101st Division, with the help of the tanks of the 9th and 10th Armoured Divisions, would be able to hold the town. I thought they would hold out at least until Patton's Third Army broke through to their rescue. The liberation of Bastogne was to be the primary objective of Patton's offensive on the enemy's flank. "When can you start, George?" I asked Patton, knowing how difficult it would be for him to move his troops over the sparse road network that linked Luxembourg to Alsace. George had asked for 48 hours. Any other commander would have questioned whether he could do it in 96 hours. George was now reconciled to the idea that the Saar offensive was indefinitely postponed, and his hands were itching to launch a counter-strike. He lit a cigar and pointed to the Ardennes bulge that cut through the thin blue lines of our front on the operational map. "Brad," he exclaimed, "this time Hans has put his head in the meat grinder," he added. "I've got a firm grip on the handle of the meat grinder." Not 2 days later, George went on a successful offensive. And a week later, von Rundstedt's counter-offensive reached its breaking point. Transfer of the Third Army from the pre-bridge fortification on the Saar River to the snow-covered Ardennes front was carried out by Patton brilliantly. This manoeuvre was one of the most striking examples of the art of command in our campaign in the West. On 19th December, even before leaving Verdun for Nancy, Patton by telephone gave the order to act. 2 days later, on 21st December, he had already taken the offensive at Bastogne with 2 divisions armoured and infantry. By Christmas, these 2 divisions were joined by 4 more. In less than a week, Patton moved north and put into battle the main forces of the Third Army, together with artillery, supplies and equipment, covering a distance of 80 to 120 kilometers. Over 133,000 tanks and lorries were moving round the clock on icy roads. From the window of my office I had a view of the gorge, where the walls of medieval prisons and the crenellated towers of Luxembourg carved into the rock stood, and I could follow the columns moving across the archstone bridge. In rough overcoats, still splattered with Saar mud, soldiers sat huddled together on tarpaulin trucks. They huddled together, seeking protection from the sharp gusts of icy wind. From the turrets of Sherman tanks, the figures of commanders with woolen scarves tied around their heads guided the bulky vehicles through the streets of the city. Day and night the tank columns rattled along the cobblestones until, on 21st December, a light blanket of snow drowned out their noise, and they now glided through the streets like ghosts. The rapidity with which the Third Army turned north surprised even those of us who had thought that the mobility of our troops would help us win the battle in the Ardennes. On 20th December, when the 5th Infantry Division received by telephone the order to march, 2 of its regiments were engaged with the enemy at Sauerlauten, while a 3rd regiment was occupying the defences north of this pre-bridge fortification. 24 hours later, both regiments were already in the assembly area northeast of Luxembourg, and the 3rd Regiment was awaiting a change in readiness to march northwards. Until the Battle of the Ardennes, I had not shared George's enthusiastic attitude to the headquarters of the Third Army. This headquarters, unlike those of the First and Ninth Armies, had no individual outstanding officers. But on one occasion I even agreed with the opinion of a general who said Patton, with his company of mediocre staff officers, can do more than any other commander I know. Almost all of Patton's principal aides had been participants in the Sicily campaign, where their performance, even by the most lenient assessment, could by no means be recognized as excellent. However, this staff has acquired hardening during 5 months of fighting in Europe, and Patton was able to achieve brilliant results from it, as evidenced by the rapid transfer of the army from one direction to another. Although Patton understandably did not want to give the 10th Armoured Division on the first day of the German offensive in the Ardennes, nevertheless the regrouping of troops in a new direction, carried out with remarkable precision, gave George not much trouble. Despite the extraordinary complexity of the manoeuvre, he directed it almost exclusively by telephone, inventing more and more ways to increase road capacity. If mobility was the U.S. secret weapon by which von Rundstedt was defeated in the Ardennes, it was achieved solely through the proper preparation of headquarters. The staffs of divisions, corps, and armies were taught the same language, underwent the same training, and learnt the same techniques and methods. This enabled us to give brief verbal orders in the confidence that there was complete understanding between all the commanding officers of the U.S. Army, and that we had no difficulty in transmitting orders. We had at our disposal an uninterrupted network of wire communications. From my office in Luxembourg, I could reach any army by telephone in no more than 30 seconds. In case of necessity, I could contact by telephone the commander of any division. Liaison officers are fond of reminding us that though Congress may make a general, It is only by means of communication that a general becomes a commander. The justice of this saying has nowhere been more conclusively proved than in the Battle of the Ardennes. Although Hodges was drawn into a risky battle on the evening of 19th December, nevertheless I was not worried about him as long as he held Malmedy firmly. The 4 first-class divisions of Sepp Dietrich had already broken their teeth on this nut, and Sepp had to shift the main thrust southwards and launch an attack on St. Witt, a small Belgian town where 5 motorways converged. Here Hodges' forces of the 7th Panzer Division blocked the road to the German troops. Sluggish columns Dietrich huddled and stopped. German tanks rushed south and north, trying to bypass St. Vitus. However, the tankers soon ran out of steam and lost precious offensive impetus on the broken country roads that made the Ardennes a veritable trap for motorized and mechanized troops. In launching the offensive, von Rundstedt had counted on speed of action. He knew that if he did not develop a rapid offensive immediately after the breakthrough of our front, time would work for our motorized armies. If he hesitated a little, we would have time to pull up reinforcements and hit his flanks. After 4 days of fierce attacks, the German command was not able to weaken Hodges' position in the Malmedy area, nor to dislodge from St. Vith the 7th Armoured Division, which fought hard with superior enemy forces. The schedule of the German offensive was thwarted. It seemed to us, although we were not sure, that Hodges had already tipped the scales of battle in our favour. Having failed to break through to the Meuse on 19th December, the enemy had to realise that he had lost the battle and withdraw from the Ardennes. When the German tanks were 2 kilometres from Spa, where the army headquarters was located, the latter was forced to evacuate urgently. However, the attack of German tanks was timely repulsed by the 3rd Armoured Division. Before leaving their command centre in Spa, the First Army evacuated over 1 million gallons of fuel to keep it out of the hands of the enemy. The 124,000 gallons of fuel that could not be removed were burned. From the 3rd Field Depot, where 2,225,000 gallons of fuel were concentrated, fuel was transported to the rear. The acute shortage of fuel due to aerial bombardment of refineries by Allied aircraft forced von Rundstedt to launch an offensive without sufficient supplies of petrol. Without the captured American fuel, the German offensive could not succeed. Late in the evening of 19th December, before leaving my command post and going to the Alpha Hotel for the night, I connected with the 8th Corps headquarters and called Middleton to the telephone. Troy reported that his corps, though at great cost, had nevertheless delayed the enemy and forced him to lose precious time. Despite the overwhelming force and suddenness of von Rundstedt's strikes on the first day of the offensive, it took the German commander 4 days to reach Bastogne. Troyes had a right to be proud of his 8th Corps. His divisions fought valiantly in furious holding battles in which the American soldiers displayed high fighting qualities. Taken by surprise and disorganized, units of the 106th Division withdrew to the St. Vith Road Junction. Here they were joined by the 7th Armoured Division to reinforce the defence of this important communications junction. In tactical terms, St. Vith, as a road junction, was even more important than Bastogne. On the southern section of Middleton's front, where Luxembourg juts into the vineyard-covered Moselle River Valley, the front line of Barton's 4th Division sagged somewhat but was not broken through. No American unit, however, surpassed in valour the battered and crippled 28th Division. This division was crushed by the first wave of German tanks that suddenly emerged from the morning fog covering the Eifel. However, its units did not capitulate and continued to resist on their own in the Ardennes forests for 3 sleepless days and nights. The division's troops fought their way to Bastogne, buying the time needed to consolidate this key position. During the first week of the German offensive in the Ardennes, the division reportedly lost about a quarter of its personnel killed, wounded, or missing. Although Eisenhower himself showed no signs of anxiety at a meeting at Verdun on 19 December, nevertheless his officers at the Supreme Headquarters of the Allied Expeditionary Force showed signs of what we in Army Group defined as severe nervous shock. This atmosphere of anxiety soon spread to the Hotel Scribe in Paris, where correspondents accredited to the Supreme Headquarters of the Allied Expeditionary Force were sensitive to the nervousness that emanated from Versailles. Their accounts of our situation in the Ardennes were so exaggerated that I subsequently asked Dyke for permission to open a press camp at my headquarters task force in order to provide correspondents with more reliable information about the situation at the front than they had received in Paris. The first sign of the anxiety that had gripped the Supreme Headquarters of the Allied Expeditionary Force was the warning, transmitted from there by teletype, to take measures to ensure that no bridge over the Meuse fell into enemy hands. "What the hell do they think we're doing here?" grumbled Levi Allen. "Are we running back to the sea or what?" Thunder came later. On the evening of the 19th of December, we got a call from Bedell. "Ike believes that it would be appropriate," said Bedell, "to transfer to Monty your two armies in the north and entrust him with the overall leadership of the troops north of the Ardennes Ledge. It would save us a great deal of trouble, especially if your communications with Hodges and Simpson were interrupted." This was the first hint I had received of the coming change in command, which would place Hodges and Simpson under Montgomery's command. Hodges for a month, Simpson until we crossed to the east bank of the Rhine. On the morning of the meeting at Verdun, Eisenhower did not broach the subject and expressed no concern for my communications with the armies in the north. Our lines of communication through Bastogne had been cut, but we still had an auxiliary line crossing the western Ardennes at our disposal. Another auxiliary line of communication was stretched beyond the Meuse just in case. As long as the enemy remained east of the Mars, we had no fear of losing contact with either the 1st or the 9th Armies. And indeed, this communication was never interrupted. Bedell's sudden suggestion made me react quickly. "I doubt the advisability of such a change in command," I said. "If we want to knock the Germans out of the Ardennes, it is easier to coordinate the offensive from our headquarters. If Montgomery comes on the scene, as suggested Bedell, then the actions of the two groups of armies will have to coordinate the Supreme Headquarters of the Allied Expeditionary Force." But Smith stood his ground. "It seems quite logical," he said. "Monty will be responsible for operations north of the Ardennes bulge, due south." "Bedell, I find it hard to object to that suggestion," I said. "I would agree with you completely if Monty were an American. In that case, it would be logical." At this crucial moment, I could not explain to him that I feared only one thing: how this forced reassignment of my two armies to Montgomery would not lead to discredit the American command. The expediency of the resubordination of the armies could not be disputed. It was quite logical to temporarily subordinate the group of armies operating north of the Ardennes bulge, all the armies north of the wedged German troops. In addition, if von Rundstedt forced the Mars in the band of our American armies, the 21st Army Group Montgomery would be under attack. In order to cover his troops, Monty undoubtedly had to position a reserve on his right flank. All the same, if he had been reassigned both American armies and assigned a strip as far as the Ardennes Ledge, he would, in all probability, use his reserve in the event of an enemy breakthrough to the Meuse. "I have no doubt," I remarked to Smith, "that if we go the way you suggest, we shall get more help from the British in the form of reserves." I asked if the reassignment of Montgomery's armies would be temporary. Bedell agreed that it should be temporary and remain in force only until the Ardennes bulge could be eliminated. After Smith had assured me that the reassignment of the armies would be temporary, I had no objection except concern for the preservation of my prestige. The Allied High Command had to formally state the motives for reassigning the American armies to Monty. Otherwise, this reassignment could be understood in such a way that Eisenhower lost confidence in me, or, even worse, in the American command as a whole. Well, if in the eyes of public opinion will be discredited only I alone, then Eisenhower can easily rectify the situation by sending me home. But if his order will be interpreted as an expression of distrust of the American command in general, as proof that the British have displaced us, then our future role in the war would be irreparably damaged. Although these objections seemed strong enough, I nevertheless doubted their validity. It seemed to me that my fears for my future career had too great a place here. Eisenhower had dedicated himself to uniting our efforts. If no contradictions should arise between the Allies, was I entitled to wave the flag in defense of my prestige in this exceptional case? The reassignment of the army was to take place at noon on 20th December. By receiving the 1st and 9th American armies, Montgomery's 21st Army Group would have increased to 4 armies. Only Patton's 3rd Army remained temporarily in my command. Had the senior British commander been someone other than Montgomery, the reassignment of the armies would probably have taken place without incident, friction, or complication. Undoubtedly, this reassignment would never have affected further Allied relations. Montgomery, however, was unfortunately unable to resist thumbing his nose at the Americans. Even Freddie de Guingamp, Montgomery's chief of staff, later censured his chief for his behavior. And although Eisenhower had to grit his teeth to bear it all, a few years after the end of the war, he admitted that if he had foreseen what trouble would lead to the resubordination of the armies, he would never have agreed to it. Fortunately, all these troubles began to affect after the critical situation in the Ardennes had passed. Although Montgomery introduced in the battle on the Ardennes bulge only one single British brigade, he placed on the flank of the First Army as many as 4 of his divisions. These British reserves gave Hodges confidence and allowed him to bring all his troops into the battle in the Ardennes. I have subsequently wondered whether this gain was worth all the arguments and disagreements that resulted from the reassignment of armies. As soon as the English Field Marshal had received the armies of Hodges and Simpson under his command, he urgently sent his liaison officer to the Meuse to ascertain personally whether the enemy had not succeeded in forcing that river at any point. Meanwhile, Hodges could quite authoritatively give a negative answer to this question. 7th Armoured Division was still holding the bulge of the front at St. Bith, and to the north, on the important site at Malmedy, battle-tested 1st, 2nd and 9th Divisions entrenched and successfully repulsed all German attacks. The 30th Division, defending the Belgian village of Stavelot, just 35 kilometres southeast of Liège, fought with the same tenacity as at Mortain. The German wedge was penetrating deeper and deeper into the west through not covered by our troops Ardennes. But Hodges was already concentrating parts of his 7th Corps on the flank of the Germans, preparing to launch a counterattack. The First Army brilliantly conducted a regrouping of forces in the midst of the enemy offensive. Its results can be compared with the amazing maneuver of the Third Army. Only on 17th December 60,000 men and 11,000 vehicles were moved by road. During the first 9 days of the offensive, von Rundstedt First Army transferred troops numbering 248,000 people, forming 196 columns of 48,000 vehicles. During the First World War, when Marshal Foch moved his famous army by taxi to halt the advance of the Kaiser's troops on the Marne, he mobilized only 1,200 Parisian taxis and transported only 4,985 men a distance of 45 kilometers. On the eve of the beginning of Patton's offensive from the south to rescue the American garrison surrounded in Bastogne, Montgomery radioed that he intended to postpone the planned offensive from the north, for which Hodges concentrated the 7th Corps Collins. The British Field Marshal stated that he intended to first put his defences in order before going on the offensive. As a result, concentrated for the offensive divisions Collins were dispersed along the front, and the enemy retained the initiative in the northern part of the Ardennes protrusion. Only on 3rd January, that is, after 12 days, Montgomery finished preparations and began the offensive. In the meantime, the German command realized that the main blow aimed at Malmedy did not reach the goal at Malmedy. Hodges thoroughly defoliated the troops of Sepp Dietrich. The element of surprise was lost. Von Rundstedt's bet on the swiftness of the strike lost. Instead of realizing the planned lightning breakthrough to the Maas, the Germans were faced with the need to fight long and hard. Von Rundstedt was forced to shift the direction of the main blow in the offensive zone of the 5th Tank Army Manteuffel. At the same time, he introduced in the breakthrough north of Bastogne his last reserves and began the offensive in a westerly direction. However, now that the offensive on Liège had failed, von Rundstedt no longer had a strategic objective in front of him and could only exhaust his troops in fruitless attacks in the Ardennes. 2 days before Christmas, a solid grey veil that hung over our front, for the first time in 8 days, dissipated and sunlight illuminated the German tanks, blackened on the snowy fields of the Ardennes. Every morning our meeting in the headquarters opened with a report from a young meteorologist of the 9th Air Army, and this report every time was so disappointing that we came in a bad mood in the morning. Whenever the meteorologist reported, Vandenberg, who was sitting next to me, would involuntarily cringe and crane his neck into his leather flight jacket. From Scotland to Brussels on more than 100 aerodromes, more than 4,000 Allied aircraft waited for the secret collusion of von Rundstedt with the weather to finally come to an end. On the morning of 23rd December, meteorologist Vandenberg flew into the operations room, waving a forecast of good weather on the entire front. An hour later, the air began to vibrate from the powerful roar of engines. Aircraft clouds flew over Luxembourg to the front. Even if the exhausted columns of von Rundstedt continued to move to the Maas, he would no longer be able to continue his offensive from that minute. We got the opportunity to beat him from the air. On the first clear day, our aviation made more than 1,200 aeroplane sorties. The next day, 2,000 bombers accompanied by over 800 fighters bombed 31 tactical objects of the enemy, dropping on them 4,300 tons of bombs. Fighter bombers in search of the enemy prowled in the airspace above the Ardennes, hunting for huddled columns of Germans helplessly standing on the roads. Transport aircraft dropped food, medical supplies and ammunition from low altitude to the brave garrison of Bastogne, which was repulsing attacks by 3 enemy divisions. 241 aircraft took part in this operation. In Luxembourg, we could see white streaks of smoke left in the air by heavy bombers whose engines murmured overhead. They were flying eastwards towards the large marshalling yards of Trier, just over the German border.